If what? If he was in a wreck?
If he died. Period.
But what you can't tell. But what was happening?
Yeah, I know, but then my whole head was just absolutely, you know, like I was ready to fall apart.
But what was happening?
Hello? Hello? Hey, Pat, come look at this.
Let's go.
You got a paying customer here, needs some service.
Destroyed in the fire.
No, they weren't destroyed in the fire. That's what we were...
But they're not supposed to talk about it.
So, the firemen aren't supposed to talk about this.
The Texas Chain Saw Massacre is the greatest horror film ever made. It managed to codify tropes that became synonymous with the genre, create iconic villains that still terrify today, and depict an apocalyptic fantasy that causes audience to question their own reality. It was made on almost a shoestring budget, with mostly amateur actors and crew, but the lack of experience combined with a unique filming environment created something truly special. Hooper originally came up with the film while stuck in a Montgomery ward in Christmas season, trapped in by the bustling crowds. He spotted a rack of equipment, including a number of chainsaws. He contemplated slicing and dicing his way through a crowd of people, and then the story arrived fully formed in his head. In a 2004 interview with the Austin Chronicle, he said, "The zeitgeist blew through, and the whole damn story came to me in what seemed about 30 seconds. The hitchhiker, the older brother at the gas station, the girl escaping twice, the dinner sequence, people out in the country, out of gas." The most important part of that quote is the zeitgeist, as Chainsaw is truly a film defined by the era it was made in. The 1970s were a time of great upheaval for the world, but especially the United States. There was the oil crisis in the Middle East, which led to a shortage of gas, and the idea that the US might run out of fuel. The Cold War was in full force, and nuclear annihilation was always in the background. Vietnam had proven the US was far from infallible, and its military might fell short of the propaganda. The optimistic hippies of the 60s had turned into the Manson family, and coverage of serial killers had exploded, giving rise to the idea there was true evil in the world. Finally, faith in institutions had reached an all-time low, with Watergate and Nixon scandals shaking belief in the government. In other words, it felt like the world was teetering on the brink of extinction, in half a dozen different ways. Chainsaw takes this idea and runs with it. The landscape is barren, and the few people who occupy it are damned souls. A creek from Sally's youth has dried up and left nothing in its place. A familiar home has become a wreck, infested with spiders. The gas station has run out of petrol and has become a cannibalistic barbecue. In narration, numerous apocalyptic events including disease, fire, and random violence are described, and the one consistent message between them is the authorities are powerless. Before going any further, however, a brief description of the plot is likely helpful. Before the film begins, graves have been exhumed, and the bodies arranged into a strange sculpture. Sally, her brother Franklin, and other friends and partners have traveled to her hometown to check if her grandfather's bones have been disturbed. They arrive, have a brief chat with the sheriff, then head on their way. They pick up a hitchhiker, but he proves to be less than sane, and they kick him out. On their way out of town, they stop to try and get gas, but the station has run out. Ignoring the obvious signs of danger, they decide to stay in their old family home that has fallen into ruin. Kirk and Pam decide to investigate a generator that's running, hoping to trade for the gas. What they discover is Leatherface, who brutally kills them both. Jerry goes to look for him and is in turn murdered. Finally, Sally and Franklin seek out their friends, and Franklin is sawed in half. The third act of the film involves Sally freeing from and being tortured by the Sawyer family, including Leatherface, the hitchhiker, and the old man, who is also known as the cook. Eventually, she's able to escape into the daylight and flees on the back of a passing truck. The hitchhiker is run over and killed, but the other two family members apparently make it out scot-free. The sun is actually a recurring motif throughout the film. The opening credits are overlaid over footage of sunspots, which were thought to cause devious behavior, the first of several astronomical references in the film. Similarly, before each of the characters is killed, there is a prominent shot of the sun, or the reflection of the moon. The Sawyers are seemingly weakened outside, as Leatherface prevents Pam from leaving, grabbing her just before she reaches safety, and the hitchhiker is killed while the morning sun shines down on him. This likens them to vampires, which Franklin also does, calling them a whole family of Draculas. This also contributes to the apocalyptic feeling of the film. Just like today, doomsaying news articles misunderstanding scientific research would talk about the sun going supernova, or solar storms, or other phenomena that would cause the end of the world. By using the sun to foretell death, it invokes these ideas without outright discussing them, allowing the unconscious brains to fill in the blanks, which is one of the most effective ways of creating connections. The film is shot sort of like a documentary, with relatively few cinematic angles, instead focusing on the characters' expressions and reactions. Throughout much of the first act, there is an emphasis on shots that evoke voyeurism, implying that there is someone out there watching the group. While this doesn't turn out to be the case, the attitude persists, and the feeling evoked helps set the viewer up for the events at the Sawyer house. The setting manages to feel like a real place. This, combined with the opening narration claiming the film is depicting true events, caused many people to believe the murders depicted did actually happen. Gunnar Hansen recalls an audience member telling him that they had been a prison guard where the real Leatherface was kept. In this way, Chainsaw became more than just a story. It was local folklore. Similarly important is the set design. Bob Burns created almost all the props for the film, and generally begged, borrowed, and stole in order to stretch his $3,000 budget. Most of the bones in the film are real, be they animal or human. This adds an authenticity that is difficult to replicate. Even sequels in the franchise which use many of the same ideas and visual motifs fall short, because they were creating props rather than actual objects. The film felt real because it largely was. While Marilyn Burns had a stunt double, the other actors did not, and much of the violence that happened on screen was actually performed, with maybe half a safety precaution. This violence also contributes to how effective the film is. While the title paints a grisly image, the on-screen violence is fairly minimal. Too much, and it would become less impactful, just a display of special effects like the recent Terrifier films. In Chainsaw, however, the action is sudden, brutal, and over almost before the audience realizes what's happening. There is very little on-screen gore, but the way the actions are shot and the reactions from the actors allow it to feel like there is. Hooper was actually aiming for a PG rating rather than R when he initially submitted to the MPAA. Due mostly to the feel of the film, they returned with an X, effectively preventing it from being shown. Cuts were demanded, although the final film had nothing censored, as the distributor released the original reels to the theaters around the world. A big part of the effectiveness of the film is the antagonists, of which there are 3. Leatherface is certainly the most recognizable of them. A giant of a man, originally depicted wearing an apron and a mask made of human flesh. This was inspired by Ed Gein, who Hooper had learned about from family members that lived in the area. The character could have been a mute giant, a mindless murderer, but he's actually so much more. He's very much a character of dualities. He's an abuser, killing the intruders to his house, but also an abuse victim, as he's beaten and verbally taunted by the old man. He at first appears overwhelmingly masculine, wielding traditionally male implements, as well as the phallic chainsaw. But in the latter half of the film, he puts on a wig and wears feminine clothing, taking on the role of a mother in a traditional nuclear family. That was part of the satire of the film. The Sawyers are the post-nuclear family, representing the idea that not only was the traditional family an outdated idea in modern-day America, it was actively harmful. Perhaps the most human moment of the film is after Leatherface has finished dealing with Jerry, he runs to the window and looks out before sitting down on a chair, rocking back and forth, his hand on his head. In that moment he is changed from the monstrous killer to a scared child. His later grunting speech to the old man helps us understand his motivation more. He was simply doing what his family has tasked him to do, keeping the house safe from any would-be invaders. Despite being humanized, Leatherface is still a terrifying character. Hooper's idea with swapping masks is there's no person underneath them, merely a hollow shell, an outline of what a human should be. A monster in human form, likened to the Minotaur from Greek mythology or an ogre from fairy tales. He's not the only member of the family with seemingly supernatural origins, however. The hitchhiker is known only by his title in this film, although the sequel will reveal his name as Nubbins, or Nurbert. He is a character defined by ritualism and mysticism. In his first appearance in the van, he appears almost Fae-like, offering the trade of a photograph for a gift, and burning it when it was rejected. He is the starting gun for the tone of the film, the first true moment of horror. From the moment he gets into the van, there is something off about him, and in fact we don't see him in full, but rather the reactions of the other characters to his presence. Edwin Neal portrays him, and modeled his physical presence off his nephew, who is a paranoid schizophrenic. His appearance is unique, and he represents the lower class, with moth-eaten clothes and an improvised pouch made from animal skin. He immediately begins talking about his family's work at the slaughterhouse, and discusses how the new ways of killing cows with an air gun are worse than the old with a sledgehammer. The fear of jobs being lost due to new technologies has been age-old, but here the consequences are exaggerated. The 2006 film The Texas Chain Saw Massacre: The Beginning made this explicit, where Leatherface loses his job and immediately turns to murder. But it's implied here that the Sawyers family's current murderous predications are due to a changing economical landscape. His comment is also part of the dark humor that permeates the film, as the Sawyers no longer work in the slaughterhouse, but do work in a house where slaughter is undertaken. Eventually his nature overtakes him and he stabs Franklin and is thrown out of the van. When he does so, he wipes blood across the side, creating a symbol. The film never offers an explanation for what it is, although the design resembles a reversed astrological sign for Saturn, which is another astronomical reference. The mark dooms everyone in the van to the events of the film. In an attempt to wash it off that is ultimately unsuccessful, they head to a nearby gas station and meet with the old man, or the cook. Again, the character is known only by his titles, although in the sequels he's christened Drayton, portrayed by Jim Seidow, who is the most experienced actor and the only one to come from out of state. He is arguably the primary antagonist of the film, as he's the leader of the Sawyers, abusing the hitchhiker and Leatherface and directing them. He represents authority, which is naturally repellent to the hippies that Sally's friends embody. Initially, he acts as sort of a harbinger, warning the kids against messing around other folks' property, and encouraging them to stay around and have some barbecue. He appears helpful, even affable, providing them with sustenance and advice. Of course, all of this is a facade, or a mask, as is revealed in the third act that he is the most sadistic of them all, beating Sally with a huge smile on his face. In addition to representing authority as a broader concept, he more specifically echoing Richard Nixon, the then current president. Nixon was known for being two-faced, having a relatively traditional public face, but being foul-mouthed and paranoid in private. He was also known for his corruption, with the Watergate scandal eventually forcing him out of office. The old man's switch between caregiver and abuser happened in a moment, and is one of the most effective bits of acting in the film, as it seems like Sally has finally found salvation, but before the bit of hope is ripped away. While his actions in the rest of the film are cruel, it is that single scene that cements him as a legendary villain. Despite this, he had no contributions to the ending of the film, which is what separated Chainsaw from all of its contemporaries. In the end, the hitchhiker is run down from a truck, but the rest of the Sawyers survive. Sally manages to get away on a truck, but evoking the tagline, it's unclear what is left of her mentally. Her laughter is haunting, desperate cries from a woman who has gone through hell. Most horror films, especially slashers, end with a villain killed or thoroughly beaten, although they inevitably return in the sequel. Chainsaw offers no such closure, and instead has the idea that the Sawyers are still out there, continuing their slaughter. Sally survives, but she is the only one of the group to get out of the house, establishing the trope of the final girl. This is far from the only trope that would become standard for slasher films, which can be traced back to Chainsaw. The idea of the terrible place, a location that reveals hidden evils. The Sawyer home is not the only place where the murders take place, but in it exist rooms that are full of bones and dead things. It's a house in design, but not in use. The chase sequences in Chainsaw would become standard, in their design and number. The Harbinger character was also established in the form of a drunk early on in the film, offering vague warnings about the events that are to come. Finally, the use of household tools, a hammer or chainsaw, to kill became much more frequent after this film. In addition to all these narrative tropes, there are other underlying issues that elevate the film. While the film never mentions the Vietnam War, the media's portrayal of it, government response, and level of violence all feature in the film on a subtextual level. On a more explicit note, the Sawyers are representations of the meat industry, as the film is firmly anti-slaughterhouse, with Hooper even becoming vegetarian while filming. It also offers commentary on the class divide and the media. Horror has always had social commentary, but Chainsaw managed to capture the zeitgeist in a way that is still extraordinary. In summary, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre excels as a film due to its apocalyptic atmosphere, incredibly effective trio of villains, establishing genre-defining tropes, and allowing for space for broader social commentary in the middle of the grim murders. In addition to being a critical success, it was an enormous commercial one, although due to the distributors being involved with organized crime, the exact amount is unclear, with some estimates as much as $300 million. It transformed Hooper into a household name of genre fare, and provided momentum to work on whatever project he wanted. It was also added to the Library of Congress's film register last year, underlining its importance. The film is Hooper's best work, despite being a sophomore effort, but there's still many more projects to go in the Hooper Chronicles. Subscribe if you'd like to see more, and be well.